Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here. And with this particular lecture, having it as disputed Paul and looking at the letter to the Hebrews, um, I have down at the bottom, definitely writing in the wake of the apostle, although Paul could have potentially been alive when the letter to the Hebrews was written because the dates for Hebrews varies. Um, but Hebrews has essentially been completely removed as a Pauline letter, but I'm keeping it here for tradition's sake. I can remember, and I've mentioned before that I belong to a liturgical tradition, but I can remember, hearing the scripture readings, and the lector would come up and state a reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Hebrews, and now it's just become a reading from the letter to the Hebrews. So Hebrews has essentially been completely removed as a Pauline letter, and in many respects is now placed among the Catholic letters. But look a little bit with the authorship and the date. Even among very conservative historians, those that would maintain or conserve the traditions, you could say Hebrews has essentially been removed as a Pauline letter, but I'm keeping it here for tradition's sake. Questions about the authorship of Hebrews was discussed even within early Christianity, but Christians ultimately convinced themselves that Paul was the author. So, I've mentioned how, the word conservative refers to conserve or maintain, and of the letters of Paul that are disputed, conservative historians would be ones that would maintain, Paul being the author. But even among your very conservative historians, they've essentially stated that um, Hebrews is just not a Pauline letter. And I'm going to say that this is probably the case of all historians, and I'm factoring in the conservative ones, that pretty much 99% would say that Hebrews was not written by Paul. I'm just giving a 1% margin of error. And I'm probably being liberal by even giving that. But, essentially Christians, early Christians convinced themselves that Paul was the author. And a lot of that has to do with the ending of the letter to the Hebrews, which I'm going to read here. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, bear word of my exhortation, for I have written to you briefly. I want you to know that our brother Timothy has been set free, and if he comes in time, he will be with me when I see you. Greet all your leaders and all the saints. Those from Italy send you greetings. Grace be with all of you. Well, the reference there to Timothy certainly made them think that this was Paul because, of course, Timothy was one of Paul's spiritual children. That it's thought that, this was Paul, and they, convinced themselves of that, despite the fact that the rhetoric throughout Hebrews in almost every way is not a Pauline letter. And I'm going to read something more of that too, but I mentioned how, of the disputed letters, I don't hold that Second Thessalonians was written by Paul, but I think whoever did write the letter did a good job of trying to be him, trying to pretend to be him. But you don't even have that with the letter to the Hebrews. And so, adding to that, I'm going to read here a portion from Origen of Alexandria. Origen of Alexandria was a presbyter slash priest from Alexandria. He was posthumously condemned for a lot of his views. Um, and so a lot of his writings were destroyed, but they've been preserved in other areas. And this is quoted from Eusebius's church history. Eusebius was the bishop of Caesarea, and so his work, Church History, where he quotes Origen. And this is Origen commenting on the letter to the Hebrews. That the verbal style of the epistle or letter entitled to the Hebrews is not rude like the language of the apostle who acknowledged himself rude in speech, a reference to 2 Corinthians. That is an expression. but that its dictation is pure Greek. Anyone who has the power to discern differences of phraseology will acknowledge. Moreover, that the thoughts of the epistle are admirable and not inferior to the acknowledged apostolic writings, anyone who carefully examines the apostolic text will admit. If I gave my opinion, I should say that the thoughts are those of the apostle, but the dictation and phraseology are those of someone who remembered the apostolic teachings and wrote down at his leisure what had been said by his teacher. Therefore, if any church holds that this epistle is by Paul, let it be commended for this. For not without reason have the ancients handed it down as Paul's. But who wrote the epistle? In truth, God knows. The statement of some who have gone before us is that Clement, bishop of the Romans, wrote the epistle. Clement, one of the early bishops of Rome, or popes, and of others that Luke, the author of the Gospels, or the Gospel, excuse me, and the Acts wrote it. But let this suffice on these matters. So I kind of referenced there, what Origen stated, that in terms of whoever really wrote the epistle, God knows, God only knows. But the letter was likely written from Rome. The reference there to Italy is more than likely Rome. And the dates for Hebrews range from 64 CE/AD to 90 CE/AD. So the letter, it was likely written from Rome. I will admit, I don't think Paul would have any problems with the contents of the letter, but obviously the language is just not him. And the dates range from 64 to 90 CE/AD. And I'll mention in this lecture part of the reason for those dates. But look a little bit at the theme and the contents with the letter. Well, essentially, the main theme or the thesis behind the letter to the Hebrews is to show that Jesus is superior to anything potentially offered within Judaism. So that's the main thesis behind the letter, is to try to show that Jesus is superior to anything offered within Judaism. And the purpose behind it being written, arguably, I give as the earliest date 64 CE/AD. That was the year that the Roman Emperor Nero started persecuting Christians. So you would have had Christians who were Jewish and those who were Gentile, and not liking the idea of being persecuted because of your faith, it would perhaps make them consider going to a similar faith, in this case, Judaism. In the case with the Gentiles who embrace Christianity, um, not liking the idea of being persecuted, this would make, Judaism appealing to them. And from the perspective of whoever wrote the letter to the Hebrews, that would be a big, big mistake, because Jesus is superior to anything within Judaism. And kind of starting off with that, God speaks to us through Jesus and not through prophets. So the author mentions how, previously our ancestors, God spoke to us through the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, but now God speaks to us through Jesus. So Jesus is superior to the Hebrew prophets. And Jesus is superior to all the members of God's heavenly court. The members of God's heavenly court, of course, would refer to angels. And Jesus is superior to the angels because Jesus is the Son of God. And Jesus is superior to Moses because he is the Son of God. Moses, of course, is important. He led the children of Israel out of Egypt and to the promised land, and he gave them the law, the Torah. But Jesus is God's son, and that makes him superior to Moses. And likewise, Jesus is superior to Abraham, the father of the faith, and also to the Jewish priesthood, because Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So Melchizedek, this legendary figure, this king of Salem, when he arrives, before Abraham, Abraham gives him a tenth of what he had, because Melchizedek was superior to Abraham, the father of the faith. And Jesus, being a priest in the order of Melchizedek, would make him superior to Abraham, and also his priesthood, which Christians share in according to traditional theology by baptism, would make them superior to the Jewish priesthood. And to say something about the Jewish priesthood here, um, the author mentions how all the sacrificial rituals, the sin offerings of the priests in the temple, have to be repeated over and over again. But with Jesus, his one sacrifice, his death on the cross, did away with any further sin offerings. Now, if the letter to the Hebrews was, of course, written in, its early date I gave, 64 CE, the temple priesthood still would have been functioning because it had not yet been destroyed by the Romans. But later dates could still be given. Um, Even if this letter was written after the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, the author still could have been aware of the priestly rituals if he had access to Leviticus. And arguably he did, so he could comment on that. And also, at that time period that I gave, where I listed 90 CE/AD is perhaps the latest year for Hebrews, but we can go a few years after that. Even though the temple was destroyed, there was, of course, certainly the possibility of it coming back during that time period. Because after, 20 years, a generation, about after the Roman Jewish War, Jewish leaders asked the Romans to allow them to, build a rabbinical school in Jamnia, and this was granted. So certainly there was a possibility of perhaps the temple being rebuilt, because you only had, within a generation, you had plenty of people who could still remember the temple in Jerusalem and all the rituals associated with it. Unlike the case now within Judaism, occasionally the question gets asked, why don't the Jewish people rebuild the temple? Because in theory they could. They control the land where they could have it rebuilt, but there's been really no major desire. I mean, there's a minority desire, a minority number of Jews that have, mentioned bringing it back, but nothing really major. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Judaism has been practiced as it has been for, 1900 years plus, going on 2000 years. No practicing Jew remembers the temple life. Unlike, for example, when the first temple was destroyed and then the building of the second one, the text from Isaiah, Ezra mentions those weeping because they could remember the original temple built by Solomon. You don't have that in contemporary times. So, anyway, that's all that we have for the letter to the Hebrews. So, if you do have some questions, please feel free to send me an email. Till then, take care.